Now, the common trope behind this story is that the Minotaur was a beast. It was half man, half bull, and it was hidden in the labyrinth because it was far too dangerous to exist among people and mortals. That is the version that got passed down a lot. It's the monster in the maze, the hero is sent in, and the order is restored, and it's clean, and it's moral, and it's finished, and everyone understands it from start to finish. But if you slow that story down, and you delve a little deeper into it, and you stop reading it like a fable meant to reassure you as a person, it starts to feel less like a victory and more like a cover-up for what actually happened. The Minotaur did not choose its own form. It did not choose to be born wrong to what society labeled it as. Instead, it was the consequence of somebody else's desire and somebody else's shame. It was somebody else's refusal to take responsibility that led it to be that way it was, the half bull, half man. And instead of facing that reality, they hid the truth and they created fallacy. They hid the results and they didn't fix the problem. Instead, what they did was they built around the problem. They built stone corridors, they built dead ends, they built confusion by mental design. The labyrinth was not built to protect people from the Minotaur. It was to protect people from having to even look at it. Now, when something is hidden, it's so much easier to label it than if it was in public. It's a monster, it's a threat, it's an abomination. And once you give the Minotaur or anything the name like that, you do not have to understand the Minotaur. You don't have to ask it where it came from or what it needs or what it wants or what it thinks about. Monsters do not get any sort of context. Monsters get containment and monsters get walls and distance, and they get erased without any sort of guilt by anyone. They get labeled without any sort of guilt. Now, that Minotaur, that same Minotaur locked into that labyrinth, grew up alone. It had no language to explain itself, and it had no mirror to recognize itself as wrong. It had no relationship besides violence and besides being seen as incorrect. People weren't sent into that labyrinth to help that Minotaur or understand it. Instead, they were sent into there to die. And it's not because that Minotaur kept asking them, send another person, I'm demanding blood, but simply because of the fact that sacrifice was easier than responsibility. Now, over time, that creature became exactly what it was treated as. It was violent, it was feral, and it was inhuman. And then that violence was used as justification and proof that isolation was necessary all along. And that loop is what actually matters. That loop is the defining feature that people seem to miss. The very fact that it was treated as violent is what turned it into violent, and that violence that it then formed from that treatment is the thing that justified their treatment of it like that. It's a bit paradoxical. That loop is not mythological. That loop is not something just made up in stories. That loop is the most human thing about the Minotaur's story. That is the same way that societies deal with anything that they do not know how to integrate into it. Anything that doesn't fit the image that they want to maintain, and anything that's too strange or too intense or too uncomfortable for them. They don't sit with it. You don't sit with it. You don't understand it, and you don't ask it what it's trying to actually signal and what it's actually trying to say to you. You lock it away, call it a problem, and then say that problem is solved. And we, as humans, as whole, as a society, do the exact same thing internally. We take the parts of ourselves that don't fit cleanly into the world, and the anger that comes out a bit too sharp, and the sensitivity that makes you feel a bit too vulnerable and a bit too exposed. It's the desires that you're unable to justify to anyone but yourself. And it's the thoughts that don't sound good out loud, but in your mind they make sense. And instead of integrating them and understanding those emotions about yourself and those feelings, you hide them and you wall them off in a labyrinth. You build like some sort of private labyrinth inside your own mind, and you tell yourself that those parts of you are dangerous and that they're better contained and hidden away from the world. They're better unnamed instead of explored. And then you become surprised when they come back all distorted and they come back in a way that even you no longer understand. That is the same thing kind of with the Minotaur. The Minotaur did not need a hero. Instead, what the Minotaur needed was context, and it needed recognition to be understood, But recognition is 1,000,000,000 times harder than destruction is. Recognition is 1,000 times harder than actually, just locking it away and saying that it's a creature, it's a monster not to be beckoned with. Killing something feels so decisive, it feels finite. Understanding it, however, feels so much riskier. It feels like you actually have to put in effort to understand something. Integration requires patience. It requires so much patience and so much humility and so much understanding of the context. Violence simply requires certainty. Now, Theseus entered that labyrinth as a savior. However, notice the fact that he only survived and he only succeeded because Ariadne gave him a threat. She gave him a connection and she gave him a way back, a way to find himself out of the labyrinth. Without that thread, he would have easily lost himself too. And it's not that the maze simply traps the monster, but instead it traps absolutely everyone who enters without any sort of orientation. The labyrinth is the genuine danger behind the Minotaur's story, and it's not the Minotaur inside it that's the danger. Instead, it's the confusion that it creates for anybody that enters. That is another part of the story that so many people miss. It's the fact that the structure built to contain the problem became the problem itself. Once you start hiding things instead of understanding them and instead of exploring them, everything gets harder to navigate. Everything starts to lose clarity and everything starts to lose direction. That you as a person start to lose the ability to tell what is actually dangerous and what is simply unfamiliar to you. When you label something as a monster, when you label something as vile and undeserving of your interaction, you stop tracing that thread backwards. Instead, you start asking who built that maze and why they built that maze. You stop asking what was avoided, and as long as you don't ask that, you keep repeating that same pattern over and over. Now there's new monsters and there's new labyrinths and there's the same avoidance in those new labyrinths and those new monsters. Instead, it's just under a different name. The Minotaur is exactly what happens when something human is denied context for far too long. When it is treated as evil and a flaw instead of a signal. When it's hidden instead of held. And when it becomes unrecognizable because it wasn't evil to begin with, but instead because nothing was allowed to meet it honestly. Nothing was allowed to interact with it itself. Only the perception that they held upon it. If you were paying attention to the actual story and everything I've been saying so far, you know exactly where this whole thing lands. You know exactly what your own labyrinth looks like. You know the rooms that you choose not to enter in your own mind. You know the traits that keep you contained and you keep you away from the world because you treat them as a monster in your own labyrinth. The parts of you that only come out sideways and the parts that come out in anxiety and the parts that come out in anger and in self-sabotage because they were never allowed to exist cleanly. They were never given any context to justify themselves. The tragedy of the Minotaur was never, ever the fact that it was killed. The tragedy is that it was never given the condition to become anything else but a violent brute. It was never given a language to communicate through. It was never given context to justify itself through. It was never given a place in the world that didn't require it to be destroyed. The myth was never, or it shouldn't have been, about a hero slaying a beast. Instead, it should have been about the fact that humans quickly confuse what they don't understand with what deserves to be eliminated. And the older you get and the more wise you understand things, the wiser you get, the harder it becomes to ignore this fact. Most monsters are not born. Most monsters are made.